What have you seen change? And do you find newsrooms and editors more receptive when you give them your pitches on this subject?
There is a lot of good climate change reporting. It's not that it's not there. But who's not doing it? Who is doing it? Which newsroom has the capacity to do it? Which doesn't? Which editor is inclined to do it? Which editor isn't? These are the questions, because there is good climate reporting. So who's not doing it with nuance? So I would say that mainstream media, there's a bit of a fault here, because I don't see all of these issues on the front page. I will see maybe a flooding event on the front page of newspapers. I will see TV reporters at another flooding event. But it's not going beyond event-based coverage.
Some of the vocabulary we used was about global warming, the conversations about CFCs and that kind of thing. But mainly the focus of the conversation at that time was about infrastructural inadequacy. We've really come a long way since then. I think we've come so far that I actually think that the title of this session is anachronistic. It's not the climate beat anymore, and it's not about what environmental reporters can be doing to make their stories, but the fact that we need to look at climate change through the lens of almost every beat.
Every year, you can't keep talking about record-breaking temperature, record-breaking heat wave. So the story is in the nuance, because climate change happens on a longer time scale. Year on year, there isn't going to be drastic difference. So it's the larger pattern that we're talking about. And we have to be open to that nuance. Now, the feeling that I get is that editors feel that the nuance is too much for the readers. As journalists, we also struggle sometimes to tell these stories well. So the onus is also on us to really simplify the science as much as possible.
Is our environment reporting, because a lot of it is good. I think we all agree that there is a lot of good work out there. Maybe it's not going far enough, but there is. Is it doing enough to make a change in terms of policy at the government level?
I mean, if we start holding people accountable, presumably there'll be impact in some time. It happens occasionally. At this time, the regulatory capture is strong enough for with fairly entrenched impunity. It will happen, but it'll take time.
Thank you very much, and thank you to News Laundry for organizing this Media Rumble. It's now become an annual feature which we all look forward to having some engaging conversations, and I'm particularly happy to be moderating this session because it's a conversation we need to have. It's not being taken seriously enough, and I hope that we can come out of this conversation with some constructive suggestions on how we can actually make reporting on climate change more interesting and more accessible to people. So let me begin with the panel straight away. You know, when I joined journalism in 1999, climate stories really didn't feature at all. You know, and anything related to the weather or anything related to climate change was like page 13 or never the headline of a news bulletin. I'm happy to see that a lot of that has changed. Television takes it a little more seriously, or at least some TV channels do. Yesterday morning, the Indian Express had a front page on Mumbai's air pollution, which was, you know, good to see. But are we still, Naresh Fernandes, to start with you, are we still a really long way from making climate change front and center of our reportage and consequently then of our political policy?
Thanks, Nidhi. Thanks, everybody, for having me here. You know, I was thinking about the first extreme climate event that I probably experienced was on the 26th of July 2005, when Bombay had this enormous cloudburst. We had 944 millimeters of rain that way. Really seared itself into the city's consciousness. Now, almost 20 years later, every time the skies begin to darken, people are visibly nervous. People want to sort of run away and get into the train. And I was thinking, I was looking back at some of the coverage of that time. It's not so long ago, and yet we weren't talking about climate change. Some of the vocabulary we used was about global warming, the conversations about CFCs and that kind of thing. But mainly the focus of the conversation at that time was about infrastructural inadequacy. We've really come a long way since then. I think we've come so far that I actually think that the title of this session is anachronistic. It's not the climate beat anymore, and it's not about what environmental reporters can be doing to make their stories, but the fact that we need to look at climate change through the lens of almost every beat. Sports and how shifting weather patterns will determine when events are held. Food in all sorts of ways, changing agricultural patterns, what we will eat, politics, most of all, and as something as mundane as how political rallies will be organized and when. We had this horrible event in Navi Mumbai this summer where many, many people died because they hadn't thought to provide shelters but not to hold an event. So, yes, I think we've come a long way. And there's a greater awareness in how we should be covering climate change, but that also has to be much more broad-based.
It's interesting, again, just to give away my age when I joined, yet again, there was no separate climate change beat. There was also, we used to look at health, environment reporting as like features. So these were not considered serious news issues to cover, and over a period of time, that has definitely changed. But Rishika, as a young reporter who's looking at this issue, what have you seen change? And do you find newsrooms and editors more receptive when you give them your pitches on this subject?
So yeah, my experience will be the last 5 years because that's for how long I've been a reporter. I'm glad to hear that things have changed in the last maybe 10 years. And I will say that there is a lot of good climate change reporting. It's not that it's not there. But who's not doing it, who is doing it, which newsroom has the capacity to do it, which doesn't, which editor is inclined to do it, which editor isn't. These are the questions because there is good climate reporting, even with my own experience, with pitches getting accepted very easily. I've had that experience also, where people are inclined to actually publish climate stories and even nuanced ones like climate science, climate policy, climate change litigation. These are very niche topics, and I have found an audience, I have found editors, I have found newsrooms which are willing to publish it very quickly. So who's not doing it? For example, if I talk about TV, I've never seen TV cover maybe something with nuance. So TV will go when there's an event. Right? When there's an event, when there's a flooding event, when there's air pollution in Delhi in December or November, TV will go cover it there. But then if you track online, you'll know that a lot of climate reporters are tracking the science of it. We are tracking the policy of it. We are tracking climate litigation, for example. So who's not doing it with nuance? So I would say that mainstream media, there's a bit of a fault here because I don't see all of these issues on the front page. I will see maybe a flooding event on the front page of newspapers. I will see TV reporters at another flooding event, but it's not going beyond event-based coverage. So I think I would say that this is because there is a lot of good reporting, mostly online these days, and very good long-form ones, supported by big grants also. So there are people doing it. There are people doing it well. So I think mainstream, yes, I think there is a lot of.
I think that's true. Disha, Shetty, I wanted to ask you about that because Rishika raised an important point about nuance and the fact that climate reporting tends to be very event-based. I can speak for TV. In fact, on television, everything is event-based. And so if it is, the hottest day of the year, it's crossed 50 somewhere, or it's a major flood or whatever, TV will cover it in a big way, or it'll cover Delhi's air pollution, and then it'll forget about it the rest of the year. Whereas we have bad air in Delhi, by the way, most of the year. Like most of the time we have I think last year we had 2 good air days. So that tells you the seriousness of the situation here. But I wonder that when we talk about nuance and incremental reporting on climate, there's a worry that we get trapped in jargon as well, and it doesn't become interesting enough to people it just goes over their heads. I confess it goes over my head half the time as well because there's just so much jargon. So how do we demystify that?
Right. So firstly, it's nice to see a topic like climate change being discussed in forums like these now. I started reporting on climate change in 2018 for India Spend, and I traveled across the country for 6 months, reporting from 7 states. And from then till now, I see that the appetite for climate reporting has drastically gone up. Editors are definitely interested. Just like Rishika said, your pitches get accepted, and there is, I think, reader interest as well. Now, I think we're at a stage where we are open to climate reporting. We understand it's important. We know that it's happening. But the story, every year, you can't keep talking about record-breaking temperature, record-breaking heat wave. So the story is in the nuance, because climate change happens on a longer time scale. Year on year, there isn't going to be drastic difference. So it's the larger pattern that we're talking about. And we have to be open to that nuance. Now, the feeling that I get is that editors feel that the nuance is too much for the readers. As journalists, we also struggle sometimes to tell these stories well. So the onus is also on us to really simplify the science as much as possible. But I think we also need to get some data from the reader's side, and I think that we're assuming that this is, we don't know what is the level of nuance people are open to. And that's something that I would like to see more data on, understand more, so that we can deliver on that, because the story is the nuance. There is uncertainty in the story. A lot of climate science is about this may happen, this is the probability of it happening. It's not certainty. And that makes it difficult in terms of headlines. And that's the struggle I think we as journalists, editors, everyone is in the media right now.
Can I ask you that, do you have any data or feedback that you get on how climate stories are doing online? I mean, is there any way for you to measure that?
I think Naresh might be able to answer that. I don't know personally. As a reporter, I only get feedback from what readers tell me. And that feedback is quite encouraging. Especially young people are very interested. I also hear a lot about climate grief, climate anxiety. And I sense that as a reporter, I cannot just be doing stories of doom and gloom, because it's very overwhelming and paralyzing for young people who are interested, who want to engage, don't know how to. And that's the role of solutions journalism. And we can talk more about that later, I suppose.
Rajshekhar, just if you wanted to come in on that. And the point that Disha made about gloom and doom, I mean, do you think that that's part of the problem, that people just don't want to hear? I mean, there are a lot of people who just react to climate change stories, and that's sort of, well, this is a doomsday scenario that's being projected. This is not going to impact me right now. Why are we worried about what will happen in the next 100 years? I mean, I certainly meet a lot of people like that who just switch off. Not young people, by the way. I think there is definitely a generational issue here, which Disha rightly pointed out. What's the feedback you get?
I think there are two parts to that answer, really, right? One, if the media keeps focusing on events, right, it's easy to understand why there would be this pessimism and loss of hope around our future, because it's a cyclone here today and a dam burst there tomorrow and a heat wave in a third place, right? To step back. So internationally, people have been sort of talking about climate doomers, because this barrage of bad news really saps people. Now, to just sort of step back a bit, there are two things that I wanted to say. One, in some ways, right, when we say that the media is not reporting on climate change with the urgency it deserves, it's actually a wider failing of the media. The media is not reporting on a bunch of public interest issues with the urgency they deserve either. So health, education, whatever. One. Two, therefore, when we look at climate change, it's useful to understand what newsroom failures essentially make it harder for us to bring the level of urgency we need to this debate. So when you look at climate change, I suppose there are three different vectors here. There is the whole body of reportage on how climate change is manifesting itself. There is the whole set of reportage around adaptation, mitigation, climate change negotiations, and the rest of it. And there's the third vector, which is around how countries and companies and others can try and profit of finding solutions to the climate crisis, right? At this time, when we say the climate reporting lacks depth or is not equal to the task in front of it, It's partly because we're focusing sizably on the first,
But
which
do
is the
you-
events part
Do
of
you
it.
think it lacks depth even? I mean, or is there
I
a
think the-
distinction between mainstream and what
I'll come to that.
other media? Yeah.
On the other two vectors, there isn't a lot of reportage. And that's where the problem comes in of pessimism, because some of the solutions will lie there. The challenge then is that what is the newsroom's capacity to articulate climate change along three vectors as opposed to only one vector of events, right? And there you have the binary outcome where you have mainstream media which has resources but is very unwilling to get into uh, uh, questions which are either extremely nuanced and not easily amenable to sort of taking to a mass audience and holding on to TRPs. Or you have some questions which will become politically really infeasible to ask. Right? Who does a political rally in Maharashtra in the summer, assuming people should just sit around for 5 hours? Right? If you turn to the alternative media, which is able to sort of report on these questions, it's financially strapped. And the problem there comes in differently, which is that I might be sent off to report on a dam burst, but I will go with such a constrained budget that I will not be able to do full justice to the crisis, because these are going to be multivariate crises. All right, the dam in Sikkim which went down for a bunch of reasons, starting from the fact that the guy who built the dam, it was his first dam. Right? So, if I end up going into the field with very little reporting time, which is a function of my newsroom's financial capacity, I will come back with a linear story which is not very surprising to readers who have already read similar reports in the past. And therefore, this thing is not going to be engaging enough. Right? I'm again coming back and doing a story where the broad contours are familiar contours. There's a bigger point to be made about the kind of times we live in where when you start looking below the surface, you'll find that things are genuinely insane in terms of unfamiliar processes, entirely new actors, all of that. We are not able to capture the chaos of this moment.
I think that's very well put. And, you know, it's also an interesting question you raise about resources, because actually, in my experience, even for mainstream TV, for example, we actually saw our resources dwindle over the years. What we could do and the kind of money we could spend on, let's say, in-depth investigative reporting or documentary, the style reporting, we couldn't do that in the last 10 years. And that's why you saw this shift, TV started shifting from field reporting to more and more of these insane debates that we see on air, right? Because it's easy, it's cheap. You just have talking heads on TV. But I find that interesting. So I know that resources are an issue for mainstream TV also, but then I also see how much time and effort and money they're spending on sending their reporters, for example, to Israel right now, for a war which we are not a part of, to do completely one-sided coverage. And you do wonder that, well, maybe you do have the resources. I mean, it's a question of how you prioritize them and allocate them. But the funding issue is an important one, Naresh. And how does an organization like yours then, deal with that, that fund crunch? And that's a genuine issue, especially for so-called alternative media.
So, sort of, as he said, we've got a funds crunch for covering everything. So we do two main initiatives for environment and climate change. My colleague Vaishnavi Rathore is here. She's part of a team we have called Common Ground, where we look at issues like health, gender, the issues that we believe all Indians should be able to agree on, that there are problems, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum. And Vaishnavi, for instance, gets a month to do a story, which is perhaps not enough time, but it's more time than most people get to do stories. We also have a video.
We used to get 24 hours, if that. That was considered
and she's
investigation.
produced some fascinating stories. We concentrate a lot on the telling of the stories. So among the stories she's done that I really like is she focused on a bus that travels twice a week from Orissa to Kerala, bringing people to new jobs in Kerala, essentially because they have lost their agricultural livelihoods in Orissa because of rising sea levels, and their fields are being inundated. We also have a video magazine program called Eco India. It's been running since 2018. We've done about 200 videos and to 200 video magazines within sort of this section. And about a third of those, I think, are about climate change. And each of them focuses on what you were talking about, on solutions. And those are the ones that readers really sort of take to, or in this case, viewers. So if we do something on
So they do well. They do well.
on sustainable fashion, for instance, that's something that people sort of automatically gravitate towards. So yes, I think individual consumers of news are interested in how we tackle this problem. It's our challenge to be able to present this in an interesting human way. And that's often not very easy when you're talking about policy matters, when you're talking about big data stories.
Exactly. I wanted to ask Rishika about that. That what do you feel is the most effective way to then tell the story as a reporter? Is it a video format? How do you demystify it? How do you make it more interesting in your view?
This is so, as someone who covers climate negotiations, for example, which are complex, which are very complex, and this is not something that I can maybe talk to my neighbors about. But what I have started to do and what I have found very positively actually is that even my mother is interested in listening to me talk to her about what the US is doing and how they are blocking loss and damage, for example. Maybe I won't be able to convey those specific points that I'm covering in that specific report, but she is interested in listening to the broader frame of what is happening at Glasgow, what is happening at Dubai this year, and what happened last year in Egypt. So there is definitely an interest. It's just that at least when I have written these stories, I have not kept my mother in mind, or I have not kept my neighbors in mind. So if I start at least the first few paragraphs, if I focus on what is the takeaway here, why should they listen? Because that is how I explain to her when I explain to my mother. I would start with, okay, this is the broad picture, this is what is happening. So maybe if I tweak the story, at least the first few paragraphs, so that I reach a newer audience rather than going into the very specific point about this negotiation being blocked by the US, then maybe it will get more reader engagement.
So you do think about your mother and how she would,
I have,
what you would
because
tell her.
I talk to her, I talked to her about my work.
By the way, that's a TV rule as well. You have to think about what your aunt in Karol Bagh is going to do when she sees, if she doesn't get it, or your uncle in wherever, Kailash Colony, if they don't understand it, then you're not doing it right. You're lost in jargon. So,
but it's still a big, it is an issue because I don't see a lot of policy being covered on the front page or in TV, for example. And so I keep thinking, imagine the impact if there is a public hearing tomorrow and TV goes there. Like imagine the impact. Like online you see these reports every day. There's a public hearing, there are protests. And then reporters are there, online reporters are there. But imagine the impact if TV was there or if a front page coverage was there the next day about what happened in the public hearing. Was there police firing? Was there backlash? Did people boycott it? So these are the issues I think that, again, like I'm seeming like someone who hates mainstream media, but it's not that.
It's okay.
But imagine the impact, right? Like imagine if a TV reporter is there at a public hearing trying to scrutinize what's happening, what's going wrong. I would love to see that. So yeah, I'll stop.
I think that's been very well articulated by you, and you're right. I mean, there are, that's a whole separate news laundry session. Maybe we can spend a day on it some other time, which is how television coverage is driven and what drives it. But I think you made some very valid points on how you can make it more interesting. Disha, do you want to weigh in on that? In your experience, what do you think has been the most effective way to get a reaction to your story from ordinary folks?
So health, considered a soft beat, I think is another way to enter the climate stories. I was a health reporter before I became a climate reporter, and I write a lot about the impact of climate change on health. And one of the things that I was always told at the start of my career is that soft beats, people don't read it, which is something that I always, from the feedback that I have always gotten, it's people care about health, their air quality, rising temperatures, all of it, right? So people care a lot. And so when you tell the stories of how the heat wave is going to affect your health, air pollution and what's that going to do to school going children and their developing lungs, people care about these stories. So that's a very interesting and also easy way to tell climate stories, I have found. Another is I focus a lot on the impact of climate change on women. So what we're seeing now with the climate change affecting agriculture and then that affecting migration patterns, you're having an entire generation of kids grow up without their fathers at home and mothers becoming heads of households. And these were women who weren't trained and raised to be the heads of households. And suddenly you have a social shift essentially that's happening in rural areas and in large parts of India. So these don't look like climate stories, right?
The traditional sense.
In the traditional sense, but they are, because the men are migrating out because rainfall patterns are changing or snowfall patterns are changing or the heat wave has destroyed this year's agriculture. And then you have the impact on every person and every role and every social structure. And the local governments are having to do a reckoning with now. For instance, in Uttarakhand, you have villages without men and just women doing everything. They're doing farming, they're raising their kids, they're caregiving for the elders in the house. So there are health stories, there are human rights stories, there are women's stories, and these are all climate stories. And these are all interesting ways to tell climate stories that absolutely resonate with people.
In fact, I remember one of the things that doctors in Delhi started doing to scare all of us about air pollution was actually showing us what your lung, like somebody's lung looked like when it had inhaled all the pollutants and how scary it was compared to a healthy lung. And I remember the first time that happened, there were lots of like shocking reactions to it. People wrote in, and it kind of it shook people, and that was a good thing. But one of the things I would hope that journalists would want to do, Rajshekhar, is also to shake up those in power, those who could decide policy. Uh, is our environment reporting, because a lot of it is good. I think we all agree that there is a lot of good work out there. Maybe it's not going far enough, but there is. Is it doing enough to make a change in terms of policy at the government level?
Well, this question of impact, right? Impact in journalism works in two ways. Either you write a report and public institutions pick it up and act on it, right? That's what happened with the coal scam and so on, CAG report, and then the court case and the rest of the aftermath. That is not happening right now, right? I think there is a particular brazenness to how power is being used right now, where even if you write something like this, all it produces is this deepening of this adversarial relationship where you simply told that no, you're against the government at the center or the government at the state, and that's pretty much the only material outcome. The other way journalism can have an impact is when you reach out and you mold public opinion on an issue, which is a long-term gestation project, really, right? In that sense, journalism is uniquely addictive for this reason, because it gives you impact rarely, but just enough to keep you engaged with the process. But a lot of times you're basically sort of doing, so if you read this book by Jason Lutz, the graphic novel on Berlin, he has a really great line. He says that it's tempting to think of each story as a stone being thrown into a river. Okay, if you're throwing these stones without purpose, you end up creating a swamp. But if you place them carefully, maybe it is possible to direct the stream somewhere, the stream of human history, so to say, right? To answer your question, impact, I mean, if we start holding people accountable, presumably there'll be impact in some time. Okay, it happens occasionally. Uh, at this time, the regulatory capture is strong enough for with fairly entrenched impunity. It will happen, but it'll take time.
Let me ask, Rishika about this, that especially when it comes to climate negotiations, since you cover that, and we have a COP summit coming up soon. How do you find that environment reporters or those who are doing the climate change beat, as it were, tend to, in a way, sort of reflect, let's say, the Indian government's position, in these negotiations without much questioning, or is there enough questioning happening? And I know, and this is tricky because, I know that very often the government's job is to spin things to draw a narrative in their favor, and often beat reporters do end up only regurgitating that spin. So, is there enough pushback from the climate beat, as it were, to question some of the established lines that the government of India, let's say, takes in climate negotiations?
Again, I think I have a positive response here saying, yes, there is a lot of reporting that is still critical of what the Indian government is saying, what the Modi government is saying. During COPs, after COPs, when they take decisions which are against what they say at COPs. For example, the Forest Conservation Act right now. It will open up a lot of forests for rampant diversion. So at least when I was following it, what I was saying was, okay, what happened? Because if we are saying we'll create, I don't know, 1.5 billion tons of carbon sink, I forgot the number, but it's some billion tons. So if we are saying, 2 billion tons, thanks, Aruna. So if you're saying we'll create 2 billion tons of carbon sink, and we are simultaneously bringing up this amendment to a forest conservation law, which can open up so much of land for diversion, then there is obviously a dissonance, and this has to be critiqued. And there are people writing, and we are criticizing the government for this also. But I think it's also important to remember that climate negotiations happen at many levels. So that you can look at it from a national level, you can look at it from a local level, you can look at it from an international level. So there are layers of deception. You can have one at the national level, you can have one at the international level. It's good to track all of them, criticize all of them, because none of them are doing a good job. So I think it is happening. This is also happening, yeah.
Naresh, did you want to just weigh in on that, how challenging it is to sometimes question, well, it is, I guess, in all beats nowadays, to question the official narrative, but on climate also.
And that's
What's
the
the
problem.
pushback you get?
Because it involves questioning the dominant development model. As we know, there are sort of interests that are deeply enmeshed with the government that have to do with mining, with all of these sort of privilege, spectacular infrastructure over sustainability. And so to question these things, as Rajshekhar was saying, is to me immediately adversarial to the government. And in polarized times like this, public opinion doesn't necessarily fall behind what is public interest. And I think one of the challenges, again, about building public opinion around climate change in this time is the fact that it goes against the dominant spirit of the age, aspiration, consuming more. Essentially, what we're telling people is reduce your carbon footprint, which is, do less. And so everybody wants easy solutions, maybe segregate my plastic or something, but not taking fewer vacations to Thailand.
Rishika, last comment from you. What would you like to see change? What would you like to see done differently on the environment beat? And how do you think we can also, as journalists, as the media, get more people interested in climate as a political issue? Because I've often found, I love it when people say, well, why are you politicizing, let's say, women's safety? Why are you politicizing this issue? Well, I think everything should be politicized because we are a democracy technically, and therefore, we should make these political issues. We should hold our politicians accountable, whether it is on women's safety or climate or whatever. How do we because if you look at party manifestos, even for these upcoming elections, who's talking about climate change? Who's talking about these issues which actually should matter to us?
So the example that I was talking about, the mine and public hearing, this is a very political story, right? It is an issue of land rights for people. It is an issue of carbon sink also, if you take India's position. If it's an issue of forest also, it's an issue of wildlife also. So a lot of stories can be climate stories without there being an explicit mention in the headline that this is a climate story. So if someone is covering Chhattisgarh elections, for example, and they are talking about mines, they're talking about land rights, and if there's even one small mention of what will happen if this coal is burnt, or if there's even one mention of carbon sink, for example, it is still a climate story. You don't have to make every single line, every single headline about climate, but it can still have a lot of details that make it a climate story. So, or even maybe if you go to some villages along Orissa, the coastline, and elections are coming up there, for example, and if the local MLA is saying, okay, I'll rehabilitate all of these people, maybe 10 kilometers inward, or if maybe those are the demands, but they are not being met, this is also a climate story. It doesn't have to have a headline saying climate change story, but if that is the demand of the people that they be rehabilitated or be relocated 10 kilometers away from the shore, then that is still a climate story. So I think as reporters, we can recognize that there is this angle in every story and do it. As editors, maybe they could see this angle even when we miss it. Maybe if Naresh is looking at my copy, then I would like him to tell me, is there a climate angle here? What is it? And maybe flesh it out a little more. And also newsrooms to actually invest resources, send people out for 10 days, a month, I don't know, just to ask them, go see what's happening in that village. So Chhattisgarh election is coming up. Chhattisgarh, sorry. Tell someone to go sit there for 10 days. I don't know what story I'll get. Maybe I'll get a good story. So that's good investment. I'll at least have an understanding of the next few months for Chhattisgarh. So investment by newsrooms, yeah.
That's true, because a lot of our political reporting, at least on TV, is very sort of like he said, she said, you said, they said, and it just ends there. Disha, what would you like to see, done differently?
I would just like to see more resources, because I think that we do have trained journalists in climate, in health already around. So I would just say resource, which is like a media problem in general, whether alternate independent media or mainstream media. I think independent media especially has done a very good job in platforming health and environment issues. So just more resources, because so much of our time as independent journalists is spent raising grants, writing grant proposals for to raise money for our own reporting trips, and it all is with. It's a part of our job. We're doing it. It's a public service, but it comes at individual costs. And that's quite hard on all of us, I suppose, and it does lead to frequent burnouts as well. And that's something that we don't talk about a lot. Because the system's broken down, the individual journalists are pretty much holding it together when we're trying to do many of these offbeat niche subjects, which are very critical, important subjects. So I would just like to see more resources.
Rajshekhar?
Well, so one of the strange things with any news organization is that their reportage is usually hyper granular in some areas. Climate change negotiations, the reportage is painfully granular. It loses readers by the dozen with every word, right? And at the same time, a huge swathe of issues go entirely unexamined. At the same time, the last 20 years have been so disruptive. The last 30 years have been a period of great change for this country. The last 10 years have been a period of great change for this country. The madness of these changes is something that if we start actually if we start reporting properly on the kind of changes and huge structural realignments that we are seeing inside this country, right, you will have outstanding reports immediately. I suppose the argument that I'm trying to make is that if you're able to really sort of capture the ongoing moment, there is enough nuttiness in it to make for very, very compelling reports. When you're starved for resources, starved for time, you end up coming out with fairly simplistic, linear narratives, and you lose people there. So one is this question of not going hyper granular all the time, and the other is to actually engage with the madness of this ongoing movement. There is, there are multiple huge processes underway. There's oligarchy intersecting with kleptocracy, intersecting with a planetary climate breakdown, intersecting with rising aspirations. All these frames, you put them together and you will find extraordinary reports. I think about China and how well China's transformation has been covered. I don't think I've seen that density of reports on India's transformation at that structural level.
Naresh Fernandes, the editor, gets the last word.
Well, I'd like to reiterate actually what Disha was saying. And sort of, I think we need to liberate newsrooms from the notion that climate change must be done by climate change reporters, climate change reporting, and that everybody in the newsroom needs to look for how it affects their specific areas of interest.
I think that's very well said. Thank you very much to all of you for those comments and remarks. Please do give them a big hand. And you've really been reporting only for 5 years? Yeah. Because you sound like you really do, you know your stuff. So that's great, Rishika. Any questions for the panelists, please? Yes, please.
So I had a question on a point which Mr. Fernandes made. Infrastructure development versus controlling pollution. Like how can the balance be maintained, because both are important. Like if we take the example of my home city of Mumbai, we can say the entire city is under construction right now, and we can see the effects even before the onset of winters. So how can the balance be maintained there?
That is precisely what sort of policy has to decide, right? And we are obviously making very bad infrastructural decisions, like the coastal road, for instance, like the lobbying to build on salt pan land. So yeah, this is just not being debated enough. The idea that infrastructure is supreme and must be, created at high volume is something we need to re-examine.
So thank you so much.
The young lady right behind you. Yes.
Yes, the young lady has a question for her peers and also for Nidhi. How do you hold TV accountable for missing out some of the biggest investigations on environment and climate change in the last 9 years? Because so many different things have been unveiled especially by people on the panel, on Scroll, and various other digital outlets. Digital is continuing to lead these stories. Forget about papers occasionally, whether it's the Express, they might have carried a front page on an event, but in terms of their own investigations have been few and far between at a time where we've been seeing the massive rollback of environmental laws versus India's climate pledges. How do we hold TV accountable? And especially since that is what sways politics. You have the benefit of so many different millions of viewers. Of course, we've come to a stage where, I used to work at NDTV, used to as well, has been bought over by the Adanis. So we've come to a space, how do we manage to have any of this on prime time where there are so few channels about to lift it? But how does it explain this massive void in the last 9 years where none of these things which so many of us have worked for a while to get out have been carried on prime time?
You wanted me to answer that as well. I think I'll tell you something. I think part of the problem has actually really at least in our case, was funding, because our money did dry up in the last 10 years. And frankly, most investigations didn't happen, whether it was environment, political, anything. There are some newsrooms that do have the luxury of having separate investigation desks. We didn't have that luxury. Everybody was doing everything. That was part of the problem. I think the second problem is just the way the whole rating system is driven, which is by advertising. And I've always said that until advertisers are more responsible in what they're sponsoring, you're not really going to see a change on TV, because, we have a fundamental problem with the way the whole media structure is owned by, corporates. That is a genuine problem, and that's not going away anytime soon. It's also not unique to us. But I think until advertisers, basically realize that, instead of putting their money to sponsor a show that will have yet another Hindu-Muslim debate, rather than an investigation on, let's say, the new forest laws, you're not really going to see that change in that way. And I am very pessimistic about it, because, like you said, given the way how corporate interests are entrenched in the media at the moment, it completely goes against their grain to have any kind of serious investigating reporting on these issues. So I think the expectations from TV, I don't think we should have them. I think the hope is in the digital space, to be very honest.
Just to sort of fill in and say that many resources should not be the issue, because many people have done this with, 5,000 rupees in their bank balances. Many freelancers have gone ahead and done this without resources to boot, and either without the payoffs as well. So I don't think resources are
Well,
that
it is partly a
difficult.
problem in television with camera persons, with I mean, it's a little bit harder because you're a team of people who are out there. I'm not saying that was right. I do think we still managed as a channel. I now see NDTV is now like before Christ, after Christ. So it's BA, before Adani, after Adani. So in the BA era, I am proud of the fact that we did do a lot of prime time coverage, and we did have reporters who were specifically assigned to these beats, who were looking and as serious beats, not as features, for a very, very long time, and who would still make an effort. And I think we did put out some good stuff in the process. But like I said, we could have done more. We should have done more. There were certain constraints. And I think that in today's environment, to be able to do justice to that, at least on television, I'm not very hopeful, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I beg to differ on that issue that, it's only of late and only in the last 9 years that media has has stopped talking about these events. Let's face it, these things don't have TRP values. Even for as long as I have been watching news, and I've been watching news for fairly long, they only come up with these programs, environmental issues and ecosystem, things like that, when there is a disaster that happens. So I think to that extent, I agree with the lady there that somewhere I think the media needs to do more. Just pushing the blame onto corporatization or resources, etc. I'm sorry, I don't agree there.
But I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying that it's a TRP-driven model, which is terrible. It's the lowest common denominator, unfortunately. In front of you sits a former colleague of mine, Ridesh, who's done some terrific environment reporting for NDTV India, but I think at some point he realized that if he was going to do something more meaningful, he had to move out of television and do something more independently. I agree with you. The model is flawed, and it's not just environment issues that are suffering. It's a lot of serious issues that this country faces which just don't get reported because, we just cater to the lowest common denominator because of the way the whole model is structured. It's a fact.
Sorry, just one
There's only
second.
3 minutes left. If we could get
No,
more
I
questions.
want to ask you one. I'll take
Sir,
10
just to
seconds.
be-
Is there a vested interest in reporting? That's my only question. I
I'm
finish.
sure there are vested interests. I mean, especially depending on who your owners are.
Environmental issues.
Yeah. Of course. That's what Naresh was pointing out as well. Yes, please.
Hello. Ms. Disha, you talked about how we shouldn't view climate change as always doom and gloom. But don't you think that's a good thing, because doom and gloom also highlights what climate change really is?
I think it's important for us to be, as reporters, to be true to facts and authentic and just present facts instead of trying to make something more dramatic than it is. And inherently, climate science is uncertain. So we anyway have series of projections. So I don't think our intention should be to do doom and gloom. But when I say solutions journalism stories, I also meant that our intention should also not be just to report the negative side, but to also report positive side of the story, because that's the real picture then. So we should just be doing our job and then let the readers decide. But I also think if we just give too much of very sensational, like this world is just going to end kind of news, I am not sure how it's going to help anyone. And an entire generation's growing up reading that, being super pessimistic, I don't know what all that's going to impact in their lives. So my opinion is that we should just stick to facts as is.
We just have 2 more questions, yes, and then Ridesh has a question, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to talk about digital space particularly. So recently I've been searching like a lot of news websites, like especially the mainstream media platforms, for example. But the thing that I found is that especially even environment as a topic is not even being mentioned as a column. Like we have national, we have sports, we have business, we have everything, but not as climate as a separate subtopic. Some pathetic situation is that I kind of found environment news under lifestyle. Or I have to search for keywords like disaster to find something about environment in the website of that particular media organization's platforms. So, I mean, given that digital space doesn't need like a lot of funding or something like that, and it doesn't have any time or space constraints, for example. And also it's like, as you all mentioned, that we have a good consumer base that is actually reading and that is actually focused on climate as a subject. But why is it still a problem for mainstream media to even give some recognition for climate as a separate topic in their platforms?
Naresh, do you want to take that? I mean, I'm sure your website didn't put it under lifestyle or...
Yeah, but we don't have it. We don't have a separate environment tab either. I think in the age of Google, you can find what you need, and so how things are classified in a specific website doesn't really make a difference. But there are all sorts of very interesting environment-focused initiatives. There's Monga Bay. There's India Spend, which does a lot of stuff. There's Third Pole. So there's a lot of information out there, and it's not difficult to find if you really want to.
Ridesh, last.
Okay.
Time's up. I've got a big red thing on my...
I just want to say one thing because you have given me the privilege of the last word. The thing is, we should also understand while covering or while publishing this that what is the language of affected and what is the language of who are governing us. So English is the language of the people who are governing us. So that is fine for the policy making understanding, that is okay. But unless or until we promote, and I know it is happening fairly well, that people who are in Ilakai Bhasha, in the regional languages and Hindi mostly, it makes an impact if the Tamil Nadu minister reads a story in a Tamil language and he knows. I did one story taking a sabbatical from NDTV and that was published in Scroll website, and that was about a dam. You know, in Uttarakhand, in my Himalayan state, there are more than 100 dams. They generate 4,500, more than 5,000 megawatt electricity. Now the government wants to make one dam which is equivalent to those 100 dams. And that story was done on a Scroll first time. And that is Pancheshwar Dam. So this language has to, the language and the voice of affected in different multimedia versions and text versions, that will make a lot of impact if we do that.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much.
Sorry, just to
once
add,
again.
language is not just spoken, is also signed. Again, I'm very sorry. Shifting role.
What is this?
He's saying sign language also. It's not just spoken.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I'm so sorry for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much to our panel and to our audience. You had some really good, provocative questions. Thank you, everybody.